So today we'll be discussing an important topic and something which we see in our clinics and the NICU, that is the role of diazoxide in hyperinsulinism. So what exactly is diazoxide? So before that, we need to go into the basics. As we know, insulin secretion, glucose comes into the beta cell, which leads to formation of increased ATP. The same can happen because of alanine, fatty acids, ultimately leading to increased ATP. Now, this ATP, what it does, it closes this potassium channel. And finally, after this channel is closed, it leads to increase of calcium inside the cell, which ultimately leads to insulin release. So what diazoxide actually does, it acts on this KATP channel and keeps it open. So it's a potassium channel opener, ultimately leading to decreased insulin secretion. But the point is, diazoxide also works in different SUR subunits, which may be present in the hair. It may be present in the various muscles, such as cardiac and smooth muscles as well. It has both antidiuretic as well as antihypertensive effects, which we need to keep in mind while keeping in mind the adverse effects. And it is the only FDA-approved drug for congenital hyperinsulinism.
So why was the isoxide developed?
So it was probably developed because of something to do with diabetes or because of
Why?
hyper. Why was it?
So what is logically?
Maybe antihypertensive drug?
Yes, so it was an antihypertensive, potassium channel opener. You know, Nicorandil is potassium channel opener,
Yes,
which is there now also used. So diazoxide was actually developed for hypertension.
Yes.
Then via serendipity, what people found that if you use diazoxide, what will happen to glucose?
It will increase
You will develop
diabetes.
So when people saw that, okay, there's a risk of diabetes with a hypertension medicine, will you be happy? No, you will of course not, because it's so common that hypertension is linked with diabetes. So then they said that, okay, it is of no role. But then people kept on working. How does it happen? So this is a very good example of how clinical research goes into the actual research. So what they found, then people knew that potassium channel is now involved in insulin regulation. And therefore came in the picture that now you can use it opposite. This is like using problems as your opportunity.
Yes.
So it has come like an opportunity that now you can use this drug. Okay, you can't use for hypertension. It is causing diabetes. Let's use in hypoglycemia.
Yes.
So this is a very crude, a jugaad way of doing a management, but this is an interesting story which is there. The dioxide is a post, so you're not correcting the disease.
Yes.
You need to understand that. What you're doing here is only opening the channel, but you're not correcting the overall process. You're just basically allowing the insulin to be decrease the insulin.
Decrease insulin.
Tell you.
So, keeping in mind that it is used widely, there was no proper practice update since a long time. So there was this article in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism. It was basically a review article, and there were various surveys held in the various pediatric endocrinologists in the US. And what it aimed to was to assess the current practices, comprehensively review the existing literature, and develop the best practice recommendations amongst what is being used right now. So initially was a literature search. So they searched through all of PubMed and they found a total of 628 articles. But one by one they excluded, including which it did not include neonates. There was no mention of diazoxide, where there were less patients reported. And finally they came to a point where there was only 7 articles which actually fit into the criteria, 5 retrospective studies and 2 prospective studies.
So this is what again. So these are those places in which randomized trials are very unlikely.
Yes, yes.
Because if you have got a good it's like a pretest probability. If you have a good pretest probability that this dioxide is going to decrease insulin secretion, you don't need too many randomized trials. Plus, the number of patients will be small. So how many cases you will get in terms of treatment? So it is like that. It is more like an intuitive treatment which is coming. But the problem with these treatments is you don't know what the dose is.
Exactly.
Because this drug was not developed for treatment of hyperinsulinism. So you don't know what dose is best, because it is a very non-specific agent, what problems can happen. So that's why this retrospective review is important in this setting, because you can't have that many data.
Exactly what Sir said is basically this working group was just 12 pediatric patients, and the only criteria they've treated more than 10 patients per year. So it is so less. So, and they should have been familiar with the literature on diazoxide use. And then they were given this survey. So basically they were everyone asked questions such as, what type of dosing do you use? Do you use diazoxide and this thiazide diuretics for that? Do you do cardio, etc.? I mean, do you do echocardiography, etc.? And I will be discussing each and one what is being discussed. So hyperinsulinism, basically, as we know, it can be of various types. It's transient, which lasts for days, prolonged, which may last for weeks, and finally the persistent types. Transient, as we know, IDM, incompatibilities, high USC. Now, what we will discuss mostly in this talk is this prolonged stress-induced hyperinsulinism, which we had recently seen. It may be caused due to IUGR, maternal toxemias, birth asphyxia, and stress, peripartum stress. Why they have focused less on the gene mutations part? Because we know that is the only drug which is there, diazoxide, for the treatment of the specific single gene mutations. They have focused more on this stress-induced hyperinsulinism, what to do and how to do.
And the prevalence of this stress-induced will be much more as compared to maybe 10, 20 times more as compared to the genetic disease.
So, coming to the first indication, they say that diazoxide should be strongly. So they should say that the diazoxide should be strongly considered for treatment of neonatal hypoglycemia, which is caused due to PSHI, that or prolonged or persistent stress-induced hyperinsulinism. So basically, diazoxide in this stress-insulinism, the duration of this stress might be, it lasts may up to 44 days or more than that, 60 days, or it might last few days. So basically what they say, and what is important is if you have a patient with this PSHI, you wait for few days, like you wait for 7 to 10 days before starting diazoxide. You make sure they have, if they're euglycemic, not requiring any other extra, GIR, then you can wait for some time, but only if GIR is falling. If the sugar is more than 70 mg per dl, you can wait. Otherwise, if you need it immediately, the GIR is very high, persistent hypoglycemia, it may be started earlier.
So in many of our patients, we'll be called only when this is happening. So nobody will call you if they have sugar of 50, 60 and they will correct it.
Exactly.
Once this happens, so mostly you will be requiring treatment.
So order is.
So this is important that it may settle. So usually I would say beyond 2 weeks, it is unlikely to settle for at least 6 weeks.
Yes.
So it will be there. Why does it happen?
So because any stress leads to hypoxia-induced factor, which ultimately leads to, it's a paradoxically high growth, which might hypoxia-induced factor.
Paradoxical. So hypoxia is a major growth stimulus. We discussed about the tumors. That pseudohypoxia is a known cause of tumorigenesis.
CDC, VHL.
So von Hippel and SDH related paraganglioma. So hypoxia means what? Means people say, okay, I want to basically get more blood flow.
Yes, sir.
That's why you will get more growth factors and your growth will increase. So same hypoxia will cause pancreatic
beta cell.
Beta cell will become bigger, and the mediator again is the same, HIF1 alpha, which is the hypoxia inducible factor. So if the mother is having some PIH or baby is SPH, that means there is asphyxia. So that's why they will say this is a normal response on that, which sounds paradoxical. So most people used to think that if you actually have, in the sense, hypoglycemia in SGA, it is because of glycogen deficiency. That's not the case, it is hyperinsulinism. So that is an important concept in that regards, which you need to understand from that.
Can you minimize this? You want to minimize this. Yeah. So basically, according to this article, we start with a dose of 5 to 15 mg per kg per day. Now it is divided over 2 to 3 times, but once a day has been shown to be less efficacious. We start with a lower dose in those, first of all, who we think will be transient or this PSHI, or children with underlying cardiac abnormalities, and avoid going more than 15 mg per kg per day. Now, after this, we have to wait for at least 3 to 5 days because the half-life of diazoxide is around 15 hours. So it takes 3 to 5 days to show the effect of diazoxide. After 5 days, we actually get a response. Now, what is this response? Hyperglycemia more than 100 mg per dl, we consider decreasing the dose. Now, after at the time of discharge, if we want to see, the child should maintain more than 70 mg per dl during a prolonged fast. The duration of this fast is according to the age of the child. So 6 hours for a neonate, and it goes up as when the child increases age. Now, very important here is as soon as the blood sugar is becoming less than 50, the ability to make ketones indicates that the insulin levels are low. So ketonemia more than 2 before hypoglycemia is an indication of response. If we don't get this response, we can increase the dose by 2.5 to 5 mg per kg per day in, of course, 3 to 5 days. After that, it is time to taper the dose. So tapering of the dose, of course, in those only which are transient. Every 2 to 4 weeks, we can taper the dose if the sugars are stable more than 170 mg per dl. And finally, when to stop. So when we've tapered the dose enough, sugar is being stable, so we can stop the drug and finally monitor closely for 5 days. If the child is stable for 5 days, can maintain a fasting sugar of one skipped meal more than 70, then we can stop the drug. Now coming to the important topic of the adverse effects. So various adverse effects of diazoxide include hypertrichosis, fluid retention, cardiac effects, neutropenia, thrombocytopenia indicating decreased bone marrow effect, hyperuricemia, and hyperglycemia, of course.
So most important which we see is fluid retention.
Fluid retention.
So you have to monitor the weight.
Yes.
Daily weight becomes important. And if somebody has some cardiac dysfunction because of asphyxia or let's say some hyperinsulinism, it can be a major problem. So that's why, as you said, there was a question about thiazide.
Yes, sir.
Use whether you add that or not. And you add to this hypokalemia.
Hypokalemia. Okay.
Can sometimes be there.
Yes.
And hypertrichosis will happen over time. So if you have any patient who is there for 3-4 months, you will have severe hypertrichosis will develop.
Yes. So as we discussed hypertrichosis, this occurs almost 1/3 of the patients who are treated with diazoxide. It is because of the effect on the diazoxide and the other potassium channels, such as 6.2 and 6.1. It leads to an increase in the anagen phase of the hair growth. Now, post stopping the drug, it might take 11 months to come down. And it basically, according to this study, it may appear at any dose, but by clinical experience, it worsens if the dose is more than 10 mg per kg per day. Now, coming to the various GI effects, initially you might have poor appetite and vomiting, which is common. But one thing which is, although more seen with octreotide, you might see with diazoxide is necrotizing enterocolitis. In this review, 1 in 66 and 1 in 83 in the genetics form were seen. But since the rate of NEC is lower than in the background population, it is more of an association rather than causation in this effect. Next, coming to bone marrow suppression. So as we discussed, neutropenia can be seen, thrombocytopenia can be seen. The cause is unknown. So what is advised here that the provider should be aware of this, and CBC with differential should be measured at the baseline and 5 to 7 days after starting diazoxide and every 3 to 6 months thereafter.
Shall we have started the treatment or not?
We have to start because octreotide, there's no other option. Yes, it is there. So hyperuricemia, there's a prevalence of 5%. We don't know, but it is hypothesized that it is due to decreased uric acid secretion. However, there is no evidence to stop the treatment with mild increases. So again, they say that you monitor uric acid level at the baseline and 5 to 7 days after starting diazoxide and 6 months thereafter. Now coming to the main cardiopulmonary adverse effects, peripheral edema, pulmonary edema, pericardial effusion, and congestive heart failure might be seen. So starting with pulmonary edema, it is seen in 5 to 16% individuals. Now, the most dreaded part is the pulmonary hypertension, which may occur in up to 5%. The average dose which was seen is first 7.5 mg per kg per day. Risk factors include prematurity, SG, and underlying cardiac heart disease.
So prematurity, SG is
in everybody. So the risk is there for. So given this, that what they are mentioning is that you should include a thorough cardiac examination and consider a baseline echocardiogram before starting diazoxide. And consideration should be given to performing echo about a week after starting diazoxide without signs of pulmonary hypertension as well. And in the end, they also say that we recommend a cardiology consult or a careful consideration when you have patients with requiring diazoxide who have some sort of hypoplasia, cardiomyopathy, or structural heart disease. And finally, which we were talking about is the fluid management. As we know, because of it is an antidiuretic drug, so we can have fluid retention. So what they say, thiazide use, which we have learned before that you can't start, they strongly recommend that you start a thiazide diuretic concomitantly with the use of diazoxide due to the risk. This might be chlorothiazide or hydrochlorothiazide at 1 mg to sometimes higher dose might be required.
So what preparation is available in the?
We have HCT, sir, hydrochlorothiazide.
That is like Equazide, 12.5
Yes.
milligrams or something like that.
And fluid is one important thing over here because so many children over here require high GIR and they might be on very high fluid. So they have told to suggest to limit the fluid rate at less than 150 ml per kg per day and consider the GIR to be higher rather than giving excess fluids in these individuals. Now, one limitation they said because it is so rare, so they could not have more cases in this. And second thing is that the only 18 or 21 of the endocrinologists had answered the surveys out of a large lot, but which is common for all surveys. So that was two limitations of the study. Otherwise, and of course, infants should be monitored for signs of fluid overload. As Sir said, we should do daily weight monitoring in these individuals.
So what do you think will change in your practice based upon this review?
Definitely, sir. The first of all is the baseline measurement of the neutropenia, thrombocytopenia, and uric acid levels. I will focus more on the cardiac effects now because do a baseline echocardiography just to be sure. Fluid reduction, I have seen that the fluid rate has gone more than 150, 160 in many of the children. And of course, start thiazide with the use, I would like to think. Right.
And start at a lower dose.
Lower dose.
So don't see, it's not like that if you start at 50. If it's very severe, sometimes you start with 10 and
Okay,
then
sir.
go down, go up. But don't start with 15, 20.
Yes, sir.
That will be good.